Speaker Mike Johnson is drawing criticism after discussing illegal immigrants voting in federal elections. He had this to say on that subject recently.
Currently an unprecedented and a clear and present danger to the integrity of our election system. And that is the threat of non-citizens and illegal aliens voting in our elections. In the last 5.5 months or so, I've been to over 101 cities doing events all around the country in more than half the states. The first or second question that I am asked in every public forum is about election security.
Rafael Bernal of The Hill dug into this and had some interesting findings. Thanks so much for being with us, Rafael.
Always a pleasure.
So this is in connection to a new bill that Mike Johnson and Republicans have proposed to additionally, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in U.S. elections, but to add some enforcement mechanism to that. Perhaps you could start by filling us in there and then describing why you say that experts say this is not a necessary thing to do.
For starters, yeah, it's, as you said, it's already illegal. It always has been illegal. Constitutionally, only citizens are allowed to vote. As of 1996, it was also criminalized. And with a lot of exceptions for people who accidentally voted, who thought they were American citizens, but actually weren't, which is probably the most common form of non-citizen voting or illegal non-citizen voting in federal elections. A lot of groups have looked into it. They found really very few instances. Even the Heritage Foundation has found about 50 cases, and most of those are, again, people who either mistakenly or sometimes even fraudulently, again, just about 50 cases, but they had social security numbers, they had visas, they had green cards for the most part. Of course, there has been probably, most likely at some point, an undocumented immigrant voting, but there's no evidence to show that it's in any way large scale or even medium or small scale, or that it shifted any election. And what this bill really does is it focuses a lot on the ID part, on making it harder to prove that you are a citizen, or making the proof level, raising the bar on the proof level that a voter is or is not a citizen, so that states could theoretically, weed out anybody who's trying to register to vote who's not entitled to register to vote. But since there's very little proof that this happens a lot, and there is a lot of pushback on, it gets into the whole voter ID debate, which is a whole other debate. And there's the idea of, is it a voter suppression tactic? Which on the left, that's exactly what they'll tell you it is. On the right, they'll tell you it's a voter integrity measure. But really, where's the balance, and what problem are they addressing is the bigger question.
Yeah, I think what problem are they addressing is, in fact, the big question here. You cite some specific numbers in your piece. You say that the Brennan Center did a study based on the 2016 election where they found that out of 23.5 million votes, they found an estimated 30 incidents of suspected but not confirmed non-citizen votes. So even those 30 incidences might not actually be undocumented or non-citizens voting, but still that's 0.0001% of vote cast, certainly not a material number. These results were corroborated by the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, that said, quote, this is one of the most frequent and less serious criticisms relating to migration. That being the case, Mike Johnson still seems to be going forward with this, saying that it is his obvious intuition that there is rampant voter fraud. What do you make of this push being based, even according to more conservative interlocutors here, on mere intuition that is in fact not corroborated by the numbers?
Well, I mean, certainly him saying that angered a lot of people, on the left, just people who work for voter integrity. Intuition is generally not cited as a reason to make a major legislative change, and it's really the reason why my colleague Rebecca Beich and I dug into this. Let's take him at his word and let's see if his intuition pans out. And it really speaks more to the broader politics of the House GOP conference here. Like obviously, Mike Johnson is in a little bit of hot water. It's the same day. It's hours before Democrats would rescue his speakership by not allowing a vote on a motion to vacate. He obviously has to relate to Trump world. So appearing next to Stephen Miller and Ken Cuccinelli is a great way to do that. Chip Roy, who Johnson served with in the House Judiciary Committee, is also a very conservative member. Let's remember, Johnson is not a moderate. He's at times it seemed he's acted that way in the speakership. He's been very pragmatic and. Some ways you could argue pretty effective speaker, but he pushes a lot of these same ideas that the same conservatives that would almost want to kick him out for being pragmatic that have pushed. So he's touching back with his allies, getting back together with the band for a little bit, but that's where sort of the disconnect with reality becomes very very grating because there are effects to presenting this law. Obviously, it's no more than a messaging bill. It'll never pass the Senate. Biden would never sign it. But there are effects. It makes more people talk about undocumented immigrants voting. And if it's not happening and more Americans start worrying about it, it's a little problematic.
Well, what do you say to folks who might think, what's the harm of requiring higher levels of voter identification, even if it's only 30 or 50 cases maximum of non-citizens voting every year? What's the harm in just saying people have to have proof of citizenship when they go to the polls? How many people would be precluded from voting if they were required to bring a birth certificate or a passport to the polls?
It's a question, how many people would be precluded from voting? And it's probably a lot. That is impossible to know because it hasn't happened. But we have seen cases where, like, for instance, in Texas, it's harder to register than in California. So you have a smaller proportion of Latinos in Texas registering to vote and actually voting than in California, even though the presidential election doesn't even matter. We know, well, I guess Texas, the same argument could be made for Texas, but their local elections do matter. So and it's really a very strange debate that only goes on in this country. There's a lot of other countries, like including Mexico, right across the border, where everybody has to have a voter. Every citizen has to have a voter ID to, cash a check at the bank if anybody still does that, or open a new bank account, or it's the primary form of ID, but it is given to everyone, and it's necessary for anyone to conduct normal life. Here, where there are limitations, it's harder to get ID for some people who don't speak English, for instance. That's a very common obstacle. Then there is that disparity, and certain voters are benefited more than others if these measures are put in place. Very different. If everybody just had to get a voter ID, maybe we'd be having a different conversation.
Yeah, in fact, in your piece, you cite the Brennan Center as saying that they found between 5% and 7% of Americans would not be able to come up with a passport or a birth certificate. Americans notoriously have passports at a lower rate compared to people in other countries. Birth certificates, easier, everybody has one, but can you put your hands on it, I guess, is the question. When you go to the polls, do you have to go call your mom? Is it in a different state? Do people have that kind of administrative faculty over their own life is the question. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah, well, I mean, so to be clear, the reason he is doing this, I think, is something you hit on earlier, Rafael, is that Mike Johnson has lost the faith of a lot of people in MAGA world. He's just staved off this frontal assault from Marjorie Taylor Greene over perceived betrayal on funding for foreign aid to Ukraine, FISA, and so on and so forth. He says, and I totally believe him, that when he speaks with Republican primary voters all over the countries in 100 different cities, the first thing he gets asked about is this. And so, adding some enforcement, the experts can say it's not a big problem, but if what Republican voters, if very conservative MAGA supporting voters want their leadership to do is add some teeth to an existing law, preventing illegals from voting, even if that doesn't occur that much, I mean, it's a no-brainer for him to try to do that, even though, as you point out, it has no hopes of passing.
I mean, the politics and the reality on this issue are more disconnected than most, and that's saying something in this political climate. But again, it gets to how many legitimate voters would be discouraged from voting, and it's really up to the politicians and leaders to strike that balance. How hard do you want to make it to vote so that ineligible voters don't vote, but how easy do you need to make it to vote so that more eligible voters have access to this constitutional right? And obviously the conversation is not there, as you say. Like, he's probably hearing it from a lot of MAGA voters that this is an issue that they're very concerned about, regardless of whether it actually exists or not. But the politics for Johnson and for most Republicans right now is that they're very clear. They have to address it as if it were, as he said, a clear and present danger, which we can factually say it is absolutely not.
Rafael Bernal, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.